This talks about a few things. It's about how people in the past imagine the future, and the future of art. It's about what happened, so what has transpired. It's also about how we perceive the past and what are our possible futures. It's a very short section at the end. The talk has 4 parts. A short history of programming, in the sense of different waves that we've been through. The origin of this work, sort of in the contemporary period. And then a very quick sort of pass through the history of how technology and art relate to each other, and how, as technological shifts have led to new media for artists to work within. And then a few ideas about the present moment. So, one way of thinking about how programming has changed in time and how machines and technology have changed in time is through thinking about the sort of the social constructs and the attitudes of programmers. So the term real programmers comes from Eric Raymond. So here's a short text from Eric Raymond. The real programmers typically came out of engineering or physics backgrounds. They wore white socks and polyester shirts and ties and thick glasses and coded in machine language and assembler and Fortran and a half a dozen other languages now forgotten. So that's one view, and that's still, I think, the dominant cultural view we have of what a programmer is. Here's a different view. This is Admiral Grace Hopper. She was a person who was very important in the idea of general purpose programming languages that are independent from specific machines. The next wave of programming, and this is just my biased point of view of how things, simplifying how things happened, is termed hackers. And the idea of the hacker is that programming has moved away from the military complex. Programmers are no longer people who want to necessarily calculate ballistics tables, but maybe they have other ideas about what coding and computing can be for. So, for example, the generation of hackers were the first people to write a computer game. This is 2 graduate students at MIT playing Space Wars. And this gives you a sense of what the PDP computer looks like and how the shift to smaller computers shifted the attitude and access to these machines, shifted the attitudes towards programming. A next wave is what we can call the amateur. And in this case, we have individuals who aren't professionals, who are getting into and excited about using computers. And the basic language, which just recently celebrated its 50th anniversary, was very important in this. At that time, when sort of people from my generation were growing up, you would find books like this, which were exciting books of learning how to program for making games. And for really a whole generation of people, we grew up with this kind of interface. You would turn on the computer, and you'd have a blinking square. And the idea was the computer didn't really do anything for you. It didn't feed media to you, but you could tell it to do things. And so, for example, many people first started doing things like this, like 10 print, gray area, and then 20 go to 10, and then we can run that and sort of see what these instructions that we give the computer are capable of doing. And if we list that again, it's a way of thinking. It's a way of taking a thought and putting that into a construction that allows it to be acted. So if we make a small shift, put a semicolon at the end of the line and then run it, we have an extraordinary sort of visual, exciting world that we've just constructed through a few short ideas. So, actually, I want to stop that. There we go. The fourth wave, and this is sort of course, the other waves continue. This is this idea of the hybrid. So programming is no longer exclusive or exotic. Now we have people who are really, they're professionals in other fields. Maybe they're an architect, maybe they're an artist or a designer, maybe they're a statistician, maybe they're an economist, but they're using the ideas of software as a core part of what they're doing. So in a way, the technology falls away, and it becomes sort of a conceptual model for producing work. So this is an example from my collaborator on the processing project, from Ben Fry. This is a visualization of genome data. So Ben is an example of a person who is an extraordinary programmer in thinking in terms of those constructs, but he's also an extraordinary visual designer as well. So the next part of the talk is titled The Crucible. And this is comprised mostly of taking books off my shelf and taking photographs of what's inside those books, as well as some selected videos. So the materials we're going to be looking at are primary sources. They're from the era. And we also have some text from secondary sources from now. A lot of this information was only available for decades in these relatively obscure books that you could find at some libraries or sort of used or rare booksellers. But fortunately, that's really changed now. So this part of the talk is a little bit like a bibliography, and all of these catalogs are now available online as PDFs, so you can dig a little bit deeper. All these videos, or many of these videos, can be found on YouTube now. So you can, sort of, this can be an introduction that can be taken further at a different time. So first, we're going to start off by looking at this image. This image is from 1965, and it's a drawing by Frida Nake. So imagine, just for a moment, how you think this image might have been made, and then imagine how you think it might be made now. And then we'll get a window into how this image was constructed. This is a 1-ton machine called a Zeus Graphomat 64. It's a very different process than inkjet printing or laser writing. This computer has a lot of blinking lights. It has more blinking lights. It also has vacuum tubes, and it also has numbers that flash by quickly. So this is a video that was made for German television to be broadcast nationally in 1965 with some very enthusiastic cameramen. But you can get a sense of the scale and the object of this machine and the labor that sort of went into constructing it. So the computer is operated within an air-conditioned booth by a computer operator that we'll see in a moment. There he is. And this is Frida Nake. This is the mathematician who produced that image we were looking at. And you can see him here working through his ideas. So the code goes into the machine, and then paper tape comes out of the machine, out of the computer. I think it was a Selectrix. And then that paper tape goes into the Zeus Graphomat, the drawing machine, where the information encoded on the paper controls the way that the two motors, the X and the Y, and the up and down, work in concert to produce the drawing. There we have the paper tape. And then here we have the paper tape reading in to produce the image. Okay, so in 1965, we have the Responsive Eye exhibition opening at the Museum of Modern Art, but I think it's kind of proto-technology in art. In 1965, we have the very first commercial gallery showing images created and constructed on a plotter through a program in a gallery that was in Stuttgart. And we have Jurgi Kepesch's Vision plus Value series. So the Responsive Eye exhibition, I think, is an interesting way of reflecting on our present time. So we're going to watch a short clip from a video produced for national American television. And what I think is interesting about this video is how we get a sense of the public perception of art and the public perception of the marriage of technology and art. And I think that offers an interesting window into the present. We can see what's changed, and in my opinion, has really not changed over the last 50 years. I think the audio needs to come up on this.
An exhibition on view at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City between February 23rd and April 25th, 1965. Who owns the Responsive Eye? You do. If there is one thing more than any other that we like to assume about a work of art, It's that it will sit still and behave itself while we take a look at what the artist has created. But now a whole movement in modern art has come into a focus that will not stay in focus, that responds to every minute change in the way you look at it, that hops around in varying dimensions, that variously puzzles, annoys, or confounds. This assortment of work has been lumped under the collective title of optical art. How do people respond to the responsive eye? We talked to some of them as they came out of the exhibit. Did you find it as disturbing as you'd heard?
Physically, yes, it was disturbing to my eyes. I felt like I was going around in circles after a while. But artistically, I thought it was excellent.
You liked it?
I loved it.
Why?
Well, it did something to me. It made me feel that I was looking at things that I had never seen before through different eyes.
Oh, I like to move around, and it's a very moving show in terms of, activity. You move around in the show. You don't stay in one place.
How did you happen to come?
I had brought my children here a few days ago, and they'd been so very excited by the new art that I thought that I would come back and take a better look at it.
Without
any added distractions, yes.
Well, I liked the glass that kind of was, it started to look different. When you moved around, it looked like different objects.
You don't find it disturbing?
I don't mind being disturbed.
It's an interesting experiment in design, and it has made quite a few inroads in Europe with artists. I believe that this experiment started in the United States, as did pop art, and now I see, even in this show, many European painters who have taken it up and done quite successful things in it.
You brought your whole art class from Fort Lee, New Jersey?
I've taken some selected students who are interested in art to this art show, art majors.
Do you think that this is an important event?
Oh, I most certainly do. It's the most current thing around now. I think it's vital that every student see this show.
John Cannaday in the Times suggested that it's one of the most exciting artistic events in a decade.
But I can't understand why. I don't think it's an artistic event. I think it's a tourist attraction, maybe, but not an artistic event. There doesn't seem to be any art involved. Art is something you live with and appreciate and enjoy, and you couldn't live with this. And you can't appreciate it for more than 5 minutes.
Why don't you want them in your home?
Well, they're just too big for one thing, and...
well, there are some small ones.
Uh-huh. Well, I was struck by the big ones, because I didn't notice the small ones.
As a curator, would you like to take this work home with you?
Oh, yes, of course. Not all of it. I don't say that I like every piece in the show. We all have our favorites. But there are lots of pieces that I could live with very, very well.
These people are just a few of the tens of thousands who have flocked to this show. And now, for the responsive eye, a response from Eye on New York.
So that was funny. But at the same time, I think there's really deep currents and truth in a lot of what was said that apply still to this day. And while we were watching, I couldn't help imagining, what if we would sort of recreate this kind of event in the Fat Gold show? Like, what would be different? What would be the same? So in 1966, we have 9 evenings, theater and engineering at the Armory in New York, poster with engineering, sort of electrical diagrams. And there were a number of different pieces. This is Robert Rauschenberg's open score. So here we had a tennis match. We had contact microphones on the rackets that would then, over time, turn out all the lights in the Armory until it was pitch black. And then the audience would be filmed with infrared cameras. This is John Cage's Variation 7. John Cage is maybe the most important or influential artist for my own work in a lot of different ways. But what I like about these images, or I like the woman at the top in the middle, and sort of seeing how she's reacting to the piece. And this is Deborah Hayes' dance called Solo, which is also a part of the 9 evenings. I think we have sound in this one. So the 9 evenings, 10 artists, 30 engineers, an estimated 8,500 engineering hours, and then the New York Times, always really generous with new forms of art, writes, rather like an elephant going through 2 years of gestation and giving birth to a mouse. So 1967, we had the founding of the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT, and then experiments in art and technology grew out of the 9 evenings. So CAVS was founded by Kepish, and he writes that it was about the absorption of the new technology as an artistic medium, the interaction of artists, scientists, engineers, and industry, and the raising of the scale of work to the scale of the urban setting, media geared to all sensory modalities, incorporating of natural processes, and the acceptance of participation of spectators in a way that where the art becomes a confluence. Wonderful ideas, really, I think, unique at the time. Here's a photo of the studio of Takis, a Greek artist, and he was working a lot with material and matter. He did a lot with electromagnetism in his sculptural objects. He was a fellow at CAVS. EAT, established by Billy Kluver, came out of Bell Labs and Fred Waldhauer, as well as Robert Rauschenberger and Robert Whitman. So the primary role of EAT was to provide technical assistance for artists and acting as a matching agency between artists with specific feasible projects in mind with engineers to sort of work out those problems. 1968, we have more energy into this world. We have the Cybernetic Serendipity exhibition, the machine at the Museum of Modern Art, and then some more beginnings. Experiments in Art and Technology was EAT's exhibition at the same time as the machine, but at the Brooklyn Museum. And we also had a number of publications come out in '68 to start to begin to theorize and provide a history and context for this new emerging work. So the Cybernetic Serendipity exhibition had no distinction between this is art, this is science, this is engineering. And it also had an educational component. So here we have the section on the history of cybernetics. What is a digital computer? What I found really interesting about this early moment is that we already had most of the genres that we still have today. Computer-generated graphics, films, composed and played music, poems, and text. And then also in the realm of sculpture, we have cybernetic devices of works of art, cybernetic environments, and remote-controlled robots and painting machines. All these things that we're still fascinated with such a long time into the future. This is a documentation of the Cybernetic Serendipity exhibition.
This sculpture is calmed by red light and it's activated by blue light. In the second section, we have cybernetic devices as works of art.
各位，yeah, yeah, don't be shy, come on,
This machine, which consists of 3 rows of different colored bulbs, responds to sound. It's by Richard Hogle and it comes from America. Nam June Paik has 11 television sets, which he has transformed, so that one cannot see any of the programs that are going out, and yet they provide the source for some of the images which one can see. Some of these can be manipulated by the audience with magnets.
Okay, so the catalog for Cybernetic Serendipity documents what was in the show quite well. You can see here the sound-activated mobile, machines by Jean Tinguely. One interesting thing about Cybernetic Serendipity is that after it was in London, it moved to Washington, D.C. for an exhibition there. And then after D.C., some of it, the story that I've been told, went on a bus from Washington to San Francisco. And so some of these things are actually still at the Exploratorium. So you see this robot in the corner, Albert. I've been told that Albert is still at the Exploratorium. I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes. And I don't know how much of the electronics are still authentic or still the originals. And then also the pendulum drawing machine at Cybernetic Serendipity has been a really long feature at the Exploratorium. So the machine exhibition was largely about works of art that dealt with the machine. So it goes all the way back to the Futurists, to early Marcel Duchamp, but it also had a section for merging work with new technology, and this was again sponsored by EAT. So I think one of the currents at the time, one of these ideas of art and technology, as it says here in the catalog, technology now totally dominates every step of everyday life. The artist's creativity is only slowly reestablishing its prestige after having been almost wholly eclipsed by science and technology during the 19th century. That's a strong statement. It's not one I agree with, but it's a statement that was made at the time. This book, Beyond Modern Sculpture, in my opinion, is the most radical book to deal with these new forms of sculpture. If you look at the table of contents, you can see we have Chapter 5, Sculpture and Automata, Kineticism, the Unrequited Art, and then I think really interesting, light as a sculptural medium. That's something that's still emerging right now. And then robot and cyborg art. I think one of Burnham's premises was that the history of sculpture was really just preceding the ultimate goal of sculpture, which was to build robots. 1969, we have the founding of the Exploratorium. Fantastic, amazing. And in Zagreb, with the Tendencies 4, we have computer and visual research. So a new forum for this kind of work in a different setting. In 1970, we have Expo 70 in Osaka, the Information Show at the Museum of Modern Art, which is the show that strips out technology and software out of the history of conceptual art. So that was the first show that sort of removed this idea that software is a conceptual medium and exclusively only shows work by people who aren't working with computation. And then the software exhibition at the Jewish Museum. So this is an image of the pavilion in Osaka. It's shrouded in these small nozzles, so that's always sort of encased in fog. The audience enters and goes below the building and then comes up into this mirrored room with a full schedule of performances. This was also produced by EAT. The software exhibition for me is the most fascinating because it's about software as a conceptual medium and includes both technologists. For example, here we have the Architecture Machine Group at MIT. And this was a robot arm that would constantly move around these small blocks that you see here pictured. And these gerbils would move around the environment and basically contradict what the machine was trying to do. But at the same time, we have this kind of like very high tech in the show coming from MIT. We also have John Baldessari, so his conceptual work of burning all of his paintings. They go together. And then this catalog show also had some educational components too. So we have computers are not what you think, but then there's a whole series of diagrams that are precisely what we think computers are. But Ted Nelson is an extraordinary thinker at this time in thinking about computers outside of the constraints of the moment. This is our last year, 1971. Art and Technology program at the LA County Museum of Art, and the book Computer Graphics, Computer Art by Herbert Franke. So the Art and Technology catalog is just a fantastic document that records what happened at this time. It's also a document that reveals accurately what happened at the time. And I think there's a couple things that kind of are reflective in this cover. One is that we see, for all practical purposes, it's all white men. And there were a few women involved, really very few people of color involved. And so I think this is what it was in 1971. And how do we reflect on that at this moment in our time? But the catalog itself is more like a walk through the archives. We go through the projects in their raw state. We see what the problems and the issues were. We see why they didn't come off, why some failed and why some succeeded. So these are preparatory drawings by Klaus Oldenburg for this sculpture that he made. And then, so what was the Art and Technology program about? There were 3 different scenarios according to Jane Livingston. In the first scenario, the artist needs corporate assistance to produce the components of work. In the second scenario, artists sought to produce an object of art, but were experimenting with materials which, while available to industry, were still new to the art world. And then the third, as she says, the more radical approach, where the artist desired no direct material gain, but instead viewed the collaboration as an exchange. So this book, Computer Graphics, Computer Art, I think is interesting in the sense that it already has almost 50 pages on the history of computer art, when at that time it was still almost 50 years ago. And so it includes things like experiments before digital computers, like oscilloscope drawings by Ben Lepolsky. This is another early Frieder Nake. These are some stills from a computer film by Lillian Schwartz in collaboration with Kenneth Knowlton at Bell Labs. And then we also, at this time, we had fabrication. So this is a Georg Nies piece that is cut out of wood using CNC machines. So although that is the trend of the moment and really where a lot of energy is, it is something that also has a long history as well. So next part of the talk is this time travel, where we go from 1971 to 2011. And the idea is that we're only going to look at a few projects, and each project, in a way, stands for thousands of works. It's sort of like, as the technology has shifted, what new kinds of expression do we have the ability to produce? So we're going to start around where we left off with the Crucible, Manfred Moore and an aesthetic program from 1971. This is the first time that a public institution showed these kinds of works. And here's Manfred in the exhibition. Here's an image of this plotter. And here's an example of some of the work. So at the time, this is still when, you know, ABEX had a strong hold, was still, it was about expression. And this idea that an artist would produce something that's purely rational and write instructions in a system that makes the work was, I think it's still radical now, frankly, but was extremely radical at the time. This is a restaging of works from the exhibition at the Bitforms Gallery a few years ago. So, oh, and the other thing to say, the works in this sort of series are, there's an eye on the Bay Area, so a lot of the works are from San Francisco. So here we have Lynn Hirschman-Liesen in Lorna. So Lynn writes, Lorna is an interactive installation as a vehicle for people to virtually adopt the persona of the lead character Lorna, an agoraphobic woman who lives in fear of the outside world. So fear is generated by ingesting media that she sees via her remote unit on her TV set. So this is a laser disc. If you don't know about laser discs, please go and look into them. They're extraordinary. And they also allowed for nonlinear video. So it's sort of a proceeding to CD-ROMs and being able to move through video and make different choices. So I asked all the artists, these are a series of interviews that I did, why they chose to work with technology. So why even bother? Why do this? And so Lynn wrote, it was the only way to create this work that used invisible architecture for interaction. It created a space and time for contemplation and interpretation on multiple and infinite levels. Do you dare press forward? So this is a special piece. It's Larry Cuba's Calculated Movements from 1985. And this was a work that Larry spent 3 years working on. And it is in the tradition of making films from software. So early on, there were two ways of getting work out of the computer. There were plotters, and there was setting up a film camera onto a small screen and making film out of it. So this is Larry's setup. You can see at the very top the camera that's capturing the images from the CRT. And I think what's special about this is a presentation. We have the full video to see. Larry's provided it for us in very good resolution, and the way we're presenting it's kind of been endorsed by him. And Larry's also here today, so I invite you to seek him out and ask him questions about his film. So we're going to watch this transfer now. It's about a 6-minute film. And I know at Gray Area there's a lot of energy around image and sound synthesis, and this film is a really wonderful exploration into that from this time. Okay, so we've had drawings, we've had interactive laserdisc, now we've had the genre of computer-generated films, abstract animation. We're jumping forward from '85 to 2001 to Josh, Amy, and Amy's They Rule, which was just recently updated a few years ago again. This is an extraordinary piece. I'm not going to talk in detail about this one because really the best way to see it is to go online and to look at it. So in asking Josh about it, so what is this piece? He says, They Rule aims to provide a glimpse into some of the relationships of the US ruling class. It takes as its focus the boards of some of the most powerful US companies, which share many of the same directors. So why did he make this? Why did he choose to do this in this format rather than a different format? And he writes, no other medium allows the same combination of massive, persistent social collaboration and interaction, particularly software on the internet, where so many people, but by no means all, can connect through software and create meaningful relationships with each other. So in the early days, early-ish days of the web, this piece really utilized that medium, I think, in a powerful way. You can create a map and save it, you can share it with other people, and it becomes a point of departure for further research. So we moved to 2005, we're back at performance, audiovisual performance. And unlike in 1985, where it's 3 years of work to produce a film that's rendered out, here we have AGF and SUSE making a piece which is very much real time. So it's a collaborative CD-DVD collaboration. And so when asked why are you using software, why not just produce films or perform in some other way? Sue wrote, as artists, we have been able to grow but not outgrow our tools. This is due in large part to the fact that we can program our own software tools inside the environment. So as our ideas change, we can expand our tools to follow those ideas. So here's a very short clip from many movies. sorry to cut that, but I feel the weight of the clock. I'm sorry. And sorry to Sue and AGF. So that was encoded in linear media onto DVD, but it grew out of a long collaboration and a lot of live performances. So moving forward into 2011, we have advances, of course, in projection technology, which we're benefiting from today. And this is a piece by Jennifer Steinkamp called Madame Curie, and it's in San Diego, and it's really a tribute to Curie's work. Here we have some video of that. So Steinkamp writes, why does she utilize technology in her work? She says, I use 3D software to create virtual objects and spaces. I then place them into real space. But the real and virtual spaces are transformed by each other, forming an in-between space, a space your body can understand. She cites the book Expanded Cinema as an early influence for her in kind of opening up her ideas about what she can do. And then the last project I wanted to share with you is United Visual Artists Origin. So this was at Fort Mason. I don't remember what year that was, a few years back. And this project, it's at an architectural scale, utilizing advances in sound and light display and LEDs. And so I have a short video of this one too. Project's also a collaboration with Scanner for the audio component. So how to wrap this up? I think here we're talking about the present, and so I wanted to take the opportunity to do something different from what I ordinarily do, and I was really excited to share with you these different pieces. So in my opinion, we, as these larger communities of artists, that we've been aspiring and sometimes struggling to create our own technologies, and I think that's different from different times, where we really want to build something that's unique to what we're trying to do. And I think more importantly than building these technologies, we're trying to build our own cultures around emerging technology. And I think that's the difficult bit. I think that we, as communities, we have different priorities and we have different politics than the companies who produce the software that so often artists and designers and architects, the whole range of artists use. So what's different now from 1965? What has really changed at the moment? And just to summarize it into two things, definitely Moore's law has played out and the cost of hardware has come down, and that's allowed for one kind of access to the technologies. And then also, I think the importance of the internet can't be underestimated. So things like chat rooms and instant messaging and forums and things that have come after, those have allowed a different kind of communication between artists than was there before. Artists have always been writing their own programming languages for themselves and for their work, but they didn't really proliferate in the way that they have since we've had the internet as a way of communicating. Things like networked version control to support free Libre open source software, things like SourceForge and GitHub and Bitbucket have really allowed the tools of this community to grow in unprecedented ways. So I think now we have been building our own tools, and they have had an impact on art and on culture, and also on the development of technology sort of in the world at large. I think Arduino is the extreme example of this, like the last few months notwithstanding. Those were ideals that our communities aspire to. Open source, free access to the information, with a real focus on community. So some of the conditions, though, that generated EAT and art and technology have disappeared, the ones I just mentioned, but some things still remain. So what's still the same? Corporations still want to use artists for public relations and marketing, and artists want to collaborate with them. There are still exotic technologies and materials, and both companies and artists desire to collaborate in that sense. So for example, emerging fabrication techniques are in a similar place to where digital computers were 30 or 40 years ago. If you have a $1 million machine for doing a certain kind of digital fabrication process, that's not something an art collective or an individual can have in their home. And that was once the case for these computers. You would have $1 million or a $500,000 computer that artists would have to really struggle and fight for access to. And I think we're in that place now with fabrication. So I do still have some fundamental questions about how the two relate. I think the most fundamental question is, as an artist or designer, why should I care about technology? And then also this idea of learning to use software versus learning to create software. Using software means using software as a tool, becoming expert in these tools, versus learning how to make our own tools. I think when you make your own tools, you really open up the space for exploration and for pursuing really unique and different kinds of goals than the software you're using may espouse. And then I think as we start to invent our own tools, we need to develop new ways of thinking about computation. Each software tool, each programming language is just one way of accessing and one way of thinking about what these machines can be and how we can use them. This for example, is how to draw a triangle in two different languages that really force different mental models of how to think about your work. And then, of course, we have this different mental model as well. Different ways of thinking about code and different ways of thinking about our work through these languages. So to conclude finally, I think as a community we've done a very good job in the last decade at reducing the barrier to learning and making with emerging technologies. I think we've succeeded at that. We've made it more accessible. And I think the field's fundamentally different than it was a decade ago. You no longer need to have multiple years of computer science instruction at a university in order to make something you want to make. That's really been the goal, I think, of the last 10 years. I think, however, in relationship to diversity, access, inclusion, we're doing better if you think back to that image of 1971 from the Art and Technology catalog, but we're still not doing well enough. And so I think that now that we have reduced the barrier to using tech, I think really the new wave that we have a responsibility for really trying to shift this culture forward, and to not just bring people into the culture as it is, but to move this culture, to make access and to make this more of a social endeavor. And I think that as a communities of artists, we can and really should take the lead in this. And that is the conclusion. Thank you very much.